Hey everybody, I wanted to spend some time talking about my electric system. This video will likely be a little bit longer than my normal videos, mainly because it's a fairly important topic for me. I think I spent a lot of time researching it, and I spent a lot of time figuring out how I wanted to go about building the electrical system. Essentially, for me, there's kind of the two systems that are available. There's a DIY system, and then there's the all-in-one system, which is what I ultimately went with, but that's not where I started by any means. For me, the electrical part of the build was probably one of the most daunting parts of the build because it's the most unfamiliar to me. It's definitely not, I'm not an electrician, so my experience around it is very limited. Building things out of wood and doing things like that is much more within my wheelhouse. So for me, this was a huge learning opportunity. And I actually enjoyed the process of going through and researching and figuring it out. But when I first started, one of the things that I had was, one of the concerns I had was safety. Mainly, I don't want to start a fire in the van or potentially damage any components that I had installed. So for me, there's a lot to a DIY system, and initially it was a little bit overwhelming as I read through a number of things. I looked at a lot of different diagrams. This is an example of one. By no means is this the ultimate one. It was just one of the pieces that I looked at. This is from Far Out Ride. Their website is really helpful for me to learn. They essentially break it down into your inputs. So this is, solar, your alternator power, shore power goes into your house battery. You store power, and that goes out to your loads, which is basically like your ceiling lights and the fan for the compost toilet, the overhead fan, that kind of stuff, your loads that actually pull power from your house battery. In essence, for me, a brief overview of where I landed in terms of the system that we have. I have 3 sets of inputs. Just like I explained, I have 2 solar panels on the top, 2 100-watt solar panels on the top. Wire comes down and plugs into this and charges it. I can charge via the alternator while I'm driving. And I have a plug on the outside of the van that I can plug into shore power. That goes in, it powers up, and I can store power inside the Yeti, which I'll talk about more, obviously. And then that goes out to my loads, the ones that I just talked about, ceiling lights and water pump and all the different things that are there. When I first started, I started out with a DIY system design. I wasn't actually aware of the all-in-one systems when I first started looking at this. So I went through a lot of diagrams, the Far Out Ride diagram as well as many others. I looked at a lot of forums. I did a ton of reading. I did a ton of research. And there's really just a lot of information out there that is incredibly helpful from so many people that have done this before. One of the things that pretty much you always do, or everyone does with their DIY systems, is they go through and they calculate their load. And it's not complicated, but it can be a little bit tedious. An example of that is my ceiling lights, for example. Just for easy numbers, they actually pull much less than this, but just for easy numbers right now, let's say that I have 8 ceiling lights, and let's say each one of those pulls 1 amp. They don't, it's much less than that, but just for easy numbers. That means I'm pulling 8 amps per hour. So then you calculate out how much are you going to use it on a daily basis. So am I going to use it for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, and then obviously you multiply that out, and you do that for every single device that you have, or every single load that you have in the van, and you calculate out about how much you're going to use. It was a great exercise for me to go through and figure out how much my system really needed to have to be able to support how we're going to use the van. For us, essentially what it came down to is that a lot of the systems out there are overbuilt for what we need because we're not living in our van. We're going to be more like weekend warriors or long road trips. As an example, one of the things that for us, because we're not going to be sitting in a single location for a long period of time, most likely we're going to go to a national park, for example, something like that, or a national forest, or wherever we're going. We might be off grid for a period of time, for a day or two, but realistically for us, even at the beginning of the day, we're going to get up, we're going to pack up the van enough to be able to drive it around, and when we do that, there's an opportunity there to actually plug in and run and charge from the alternator. So we're not going to have these long periods of time where we're pulling load off of the battery without being able to recharge it. With that said, we also have the solar power, so even if we are in that scenario, we can at least feed back into it some. It's probably not enough. Our solar power setup is probably not enough to be able to sustain for long periods of time, but it certainly can supplement. I'd like to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of the system. This by me is no means an exhaustive list. It was just some of the things that I considered and some of the things that I thought about while I was building out our system. So the pros of the DIY system is that it actually has almost likely, it would almost always have more power. The system that I had designed definitely had more power storage than the Yeti does. It also is likely to be cheaper depending on the battery types that you buy. If you buy a AGM batteries, they're going to be cheaper. They're a lot heavier, but they're going to be a lot cheaper. If you buy lithium batteries, which is what I had planned to do, they're a lot lighter. And I'll explain why weight is a concern for me in a minute. But they're lighter, but they are more expensive. So I bought the Yeti 1500X. Ultimately, the cost between the lithium batteries that I was planning on buying plus all the other components and everything, the Yeti ended up being a little bit more expensive, but not tremendous. They have bigger units that would be significantly more expensive depending on how much power storage you wanted to use. Some of the cons of the DIY system, at least for me, is that they're ultimately they're more complicated. There's a lot more components. There's a lot more pieces to it. It just simply is more complicated overall. It's certainly doable. It's certainly not outside the realm of obviously building it. Many people do it all the time. So it actually can be a really obviously a really good system. But for us, it didn't necessarily match our needs, meaning it was overbuilt for what we were going to be using on it. In terms of the Yeti, some of the pros for me, one of the things is that it's fairly light. It's only like 40 pounds, so it's easy to be able to pick it up and take it out of the van, especially for us in those longer kind of non-use periods, especially living here in Minnesota. Excuse me. Living here in Minnesota in the cold months, I don't want to just leave it in the van out in the cold. I want to be able to pick it up and take it inside, keep it warm and keep it charged. I could leave it out and I suppose I could charge it, but Minnesota does get kind of cold in the winter, which is not great for these types of batteries. So I really wanted to be able to remove it. One of the other things along that same line is that because I can remove it, I do actually have scenarios where I could use this outside of van activities, meaning off-grid. We have some family land up north that is off-grid, and I'm actually going to it's going to open up opportunities to be able to use it there as well. So there's multiple opportunities, dual usage for me, which when I realized that this was available, because it opened up other opportunities for use of it, it really pushed me down this path. The other thing is that it simplifies the install in a lot of ways, meaning there's less components involved. This is a good and bad thing, and I'll explain that. In terms of a solar panel install, for example, I have two panels on the top, 100 watts each. Two wires come down. They come down to a cable right here. I literally just plug it in and it works. In a DIY system, you typically have the wires come down, they go to a controller, and then that controller goes out to usually a breaker of some kind, or a fuse, and then basically you plug that in. There's more components involved. So for me, it simplified the actual install of the process of installing and actually getting everything hooked up. Like I said, this is a pro and a con. One of the other things that's a pro is that there is a phone app that I can use to connect and monitor and actually control the device, which I've used actually quite a bit already, just in terms of during the build. I've been able to use that, which is really cool. It's worked really well for me so far. Some of the cons of the Yeti system, or an all-in-one system. And by the way, I went with Goal Zero mainly because there's more examples, or at least I found more examples online of people actually using this device in real-world scenarios in camper vans. There are other companies that make devices just like this. I spent some time looking at them, but this is the one I ultimately went with. I think they would all serve basically the same purpose. But for me, this is the one I made the decision to go with. In terms of the cons, like I said, it is more expensive. It does have less power storage, so if you're going to be going out and doing a lot of off-grid or boondocking, this may not suit your needs. It may not be enough for what you want. The other part, and this is probably the biggest con, is that if something goes wrong with this device, you're pretty much stuck until you get that thing fixed. That's for us, because we're kind of weekend warriors. We could live without it if we had to. We're not dependent on it. We're not living full time in our van. It's not it's not going to be the heartbeat of our existence if we're on a weekend trip or a long road trip. So it is going to be able to be fixed if necessary, but probably not while we're on the road if something went wrong with it. That's probably the biggest con because it's a single point of failure. For what it's worth, although I've had no problems with the device so far, I've made calls into the tech support at Goal Zero, and they've been really kind and helpful, and it's been a good experience with them so far. But once we get into real world scenarios of actually using it, we'll see how that works out. For me, if I can give any advice around your electrical system, if you're building on a camper van, is that ultimately I think you really just need to determine how you're going to use your van and what you need or want out of your system. Personally, I think going through the process of actually designing a DIY system is worthwhile, regardless of whether you go with an all-in-one or not. And the reason why is because it teaches you a tremendous amount about what you need in terms of storage and what you want out of your system. It also gives you a great education in terms of how things should work. It also, obviously builds knowledge in an area that you may not be familiar with, which for me was always interesting. A lot of the build on this entire thing has been part of that. It's a great experience to build out something like this. With all of that said, when I designed the DIY system initially, and I made the decision to switch over to this all-in-one system, I made sure that everything that I built into this, in terms of the design, doesn't preclude me from actually building a DIY system. If in the future we decided we needed more, and obviously this would be an additional expense, but if we decided in the future that we needed more, everything that I've built so far would actually work with that system. I could build a brand new system. The cabinet was built to be able to store and house all the components for a DIY system, including the batteries. I have space back here that would allow me to actually put in more batteries that you could actually potentially live full time if you wanted to. The solar panel system is expandable in the way that it is right now, so I could expand that out. I probably have room for maybe I think two more panels for sure, maybe three, which would give us a tremendous amount of power to be able to be off-grid if we needed to. So in essence, I built in a plan B to the system, which was important to me to make sure that I have that capability in the future. And this was one of the other pros for me with this, is that if and when we go to sell the van, when somebody buys it, one of two things can happen. One, we could leave this in there if they really wanted that, or they could buy a new one, a bigger one. It would give them more power of the Goal Zero. Or if they chose to go down the path of building on a DIY system, there's space for it and capability to be able to install and build right off of the system that we have right now. There's nothing that would stop them from doing that. The other aspect of it too is that from a safety and a liability standpoint, this versus a DIY system is probably safer if and when we go to sell the van, which hopefully isn't for a while, but it's something that I did consider. So as of right now, using the Yeti during the build process has been, it's working really, really well. I think based on that, we're going to be able to, we will be able to be off-grid for a while, probably in the matter of days, not weeks by any means. And depending on how much we use the system and use lights and that kind of stuff, if we're conservative, we can probably extend it by a little bit. But ultimately for us, I think it's going to work really, really well. But we'll learn a lot more as we actually use the van in real life and real world scenarios. So hopefully all of this helps and makes sense to people that are out there to determine, the type of system you want and the pros and cons of it. Again, once we start going down the real world path, we'll figure out a lot more in terms of whether or not this is going to work. But as of right now, I'm quite hopeful that it will. So anyways, I know this video is a little bit longer than my normal ones, but hopefully it was interesting enough to engage, and hopefully it helps somebody out there in the future when they're looking to build out their system and design or diagram out their wiring. So anyways, thanks a lot for watching, and more updates to follow.